Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. And go and get that perfect drink, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Obviously, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Angelica drove up to the large black wrought iron gates of the exclusive upmarket hunting lodge, designed for people with deep pockets, her heart beginning to miss a beat, for this sumptuous place looked grandiose, luxuriously swank. This was not what she would have expected or even anticipated. Granted, she thought it would be upmarket, but not in a league like this. The guard studied her curiously, almost as if he thought she looked out of place, as if in some way she wasn't glamorous enough to be driving through these gates in her run-down car that looked as if it was about to fall apart in any given moment. "What is your name?" the guard asked her. "I need to check if you're on the interview list." "It's Angelica Asher," I told him. "Ah, yes, there your name is," he said. "Please will you sign on the dotted line?" Which is what she did. Then he proceeded to take down her car registration number before the gates finally opened to allow her car entry. All this fuss, she thought, over an interview. I'm not visiting Buckingham Palace, for goodness sake, nor am I hiding the crown jewels in my trunk. The way that guard was looking at me, you'd think he thought I was about to hold up the Queen in her powder room. "I'm sorry, sir, if you're not used to run-down cars gracing your driveway. But just because I'm not rich doesn't mean I'm a natural criminal," she said under her breath. She drove down the long asphalt drive, neatly lined with red brick, observing the pristine fields of perfectly manicured grass, peppered with trees, marvelling at how the upper-class aristocratic lodge looked like a luxuriously pristinely maintained park, much like the likes of Central Park in New York. She drove past a meadow with black and bay horses frolicking happily in a field, along with a beautiful lake fringed by weeping willows, whose boughs of green leaves dangled gracefully over the gleaming silvery surface that twinkled brightly in the morning sun. There were cat's tails by the lake, along with a handful of rambunctious berry bushes growing wildly on the edge, heavily laden with ripe juicy berries. Then she saw the hunting lodge and gasped in awe. It wasn't your usual wooden-style lodge. It looked more like a huge Georgian-style mansion, painted in white with a grandiose arched pale blue front door, very symmetrical large windows, and a spectacular courtyard framed by manicure hedges and dozens of white roses, along with terracotta pots filled with bright red hanging geraniums. As she parked on the luxurious brick driveway, shaded by towering mature oak trees, her heart sank in her chest, for her dilapidated car looked like it belonged on a rubbish tip, as all the other cars in the lot were SUVs and Land Rovers that were worth a bob or two. To make matters worse, there were 2 Rolls-Royces and a Bentley parked in the far corner. In that moment, Angelica's self-consciousness grew exponentially. She felt humiliated, because her scrap of a car was an insult. Still, it couldn't be helped, she thought, pursing her lips together tightly, straightening her back and holding her head up proud and tall. How many people were applying for this very same position, she wondered, her heart sinking all the more. Wasn't this overkill? When she finally was seated in the reception area, she marvelled at the grandness of this place, for it was as glitzy, palatial, and as grand as the Trump Hotel that she had stayed in once with her family in Las Vegas. The mansion was fabulously ornate. Everything sparkled, twinkled, and shone within an inch of its life. She was certain you'd have to scour the entire place with a fine tooth comb before you found even a speck of dust or a wispy cobweb anywhere. There were incredible glass chandeliers dangling from the high ceiling that looked like they had cost a fortune, marble floors, a huge sweeping embellished staircase in the far end of the foyer, with very elaborate wrought-iron balustrades, sophisticated oakwood desks and coffee tables covered with ornate Ming vases filled with extravagant flower arrangements. Lavish, ostentatious rugs were flung across the floor, while the minimalistic white walls were covered with colourful, affluent-looking, flamboyant contemporary art pieces, obviously done by highly sought-after artists, along with the occasional white-tailed deer head, mule deer head, elk, bison, zebra, black bear, mountain lion, and an even African lion head, all mounted on the walls. She did wonder why the hunting lodge had a zebra and lion on the wall. Because that represented Africa, didn't it? Maybe it was to give the place an international feel, she thought. Angelica felt as if their glassy, taxidermal eyes were staring at her. She took a seat on a very long, verbose, L-shaped, dark brown velvety sofa in the reception area, dappled with turquoise and gold cushions, where 10 other eager applicants were sitting with crossed legs, waiting in eager anticipation for their names to be called. It was clear that these young girls were all applying for the same job, which was a huge bummer. But then what did she expect? That somehow she was going to be handed the job without going through any loopholes or challenges? The real world didn't work that way. Everything was about selling yourself and your accomplishments to your prospective employer. Nothing was ever easy. Angelica surreptitiously compared the hopeful applicants to herself privately, and then she concluded she would never in a million years get this job, for she could see the glowing curriculum vitas the girls were carrying in brown envelopes clearly looked impressive, but she had no work experience behind her, apart from working as a waitress for a couple of years. But she reckoned that that did not count for much. Neither did she have a fancy car parked in the lot. She felt exceedingly intimidated, daunted, and rather overawed by the young professional-looking women that were all applying for the same position. So she decided that she would leave, with a job that clearly was not hers for the taking. Why would someone like her, driving a clapped-out car, ever be employed in such an ostentatious place like this? What was she smoking? Or what planet was she living on, she wondered. No, this job was not for her. She was sure of it. It had to be given to someone who was indirectly related to Jackie Kennedy down the family line. But her? No, forget it. It wasn't going to happen. And if it did, she'd eat her hat. And she meant that quite literally. She didn't normally have such a defeatist, killjoy, fatalistic and pessimistic attitude, but in this case she felt resigned to the fact that she was overshadowed by these rather accomplished, proficient young ladies who had worked as venue coordinators for various other rather grand establishments. She sighed with frustration, was about to leave when her name was called by the man in reception. "Is Angelica Asher here?" She nodded. She was led into an office where a surly woman was sitting behind the desk. The woman was in her late 60s, with white hair swept away from her face, pinned in the back in a very severe, neat, rather formidable bun. The woman's brown raven eyes were piercing and penetrating, as if they were looking right through her like an X-ray machine, which was very unsettling for Angelica, while her matter-of-fact, brisk manner of speaking was very abrupt. "So why have you applied for this position?" she asked Angelica, tapping her pen impatiently on the rosewood desk, as if she'd already had enough of the interview before it had even started. It would seem her cavalier, impetuous, laconic approach revealed very poignantly that patience wasn't exactly her strong point. She liked things finished before they'd even begun. Angelica flushed bright red, firmly deciding she'd be straight with the prickly, slightly fractious woman, for she discerned that this was not the kind of person you could easily deceive, for in Angelica's eyes the shrewd woman was as razor-sharp and ingenious as a raven. "I'll be blunt and to the point," she volunteered. "I need the money. I was scanning through the advertisements. I thought this was a job I could possibly do. In truth, I'm quite efficacious, efficient, competent and good with people, but I'm not feeling that sanguine now," she admitted. "I can see I've got stiff competition out there. To be honest with you, some of those people have impeccable references, have worked at exclusive venues before. Besides, the only car in your parking bay out there that looks like it belongs in a knacker's yard is obviously mine. I don't belong here. I can see that now." What on earth was she doing? She scolded herself privately. You never spoke yourself down about yourself at an interview, especially not here in America, where you're taught to think big all the time. But her frankness came across as refreshing. The woman eyed her curiously. Her stoic, fixed expression changed fleetingly, almost like a grey overcast sky, becoming lighter. "It's exhilarating and refreshing that you're so incredibly honest, my dear. But if I could give you a word of practical advice, I'd tell you not to sell yourself short at an interview. It really isn't a good idea. It never is. And you look like a very bright girl to me, who has a whole lot to offer. So don't downsell yourself, and don't allow yourself to be intimidated by the wealthy. I want to assure you that at one time in my life I also drove a car that, shall we say, was a little shabby. We've all been there at one time. Well, those of us who've had to work from the bottom all the way up, that is. And that's nothing to be ashamed of at all. Do you know what the job involves? Not exactly, but I do imagine it's a bit of everything. That's exactly what it is. A bit of everything. It's a very good way to put it. We have a team of people working here with very specific jobs, but the owner of the lodge, Mrs. Margaret Grayson, needs to hire someone to be rather like an extra on a film set. You'll not be specifically employed for one particular job. Your job will be as variable and as fluctuating as the weather. It'll be one thing one day, another thing the next. Let's just say that some of the jobs you will do will not be conventional or run-of-the-mill. You'll be like a chameleon adapting to every situation. You see, when you work with wealthy, very affluent people who think that they can buy the entire world, sometimes they have more money than sense. Let's just say that some of our guests have extravagant requests, like a woman wanting her dog to be chaperoned all day. In that case, it will be your job to be the chaperone, or a lonely old man or woman that wants someone to sit with him or her at dinner that night, to keep him company. It might be someone wanting you to follow them around with their hunting gear, or you might be asked to read a child a book for the night, or to look after someone's little girl. Other times you may help wherever you're needed, whether it's in the kitchen, reception, or even cleaning. So it's a little bit like being a jack of all trades. Are you up for a job like that? Definitely, said Angelica, brightening. I think I'd enjoy that kind of versatile job. Don't they say variety is the spice of life? So how many people do you actually have staying at the lodge at one time? Never more than 12 at a time. The lodge is exclusive. The costs per booking are extremely expensive. So it's our job to offer our guests an exemplary service and a fabulous time. People can book into the lodge for fishing all year round at the lake. Then we have people coming to stay here during the hunting season to try their hand with taking down any kind of animal, from a deer, a moose, a mule deer, an elk, a bison, a bighorn sheep, or even a mountain goat. Depends on what tickles their fancy, really. It sounds like a job I could do, said Angelica. I mean, it's an all-hands-on-deck job, but my bet is you need to use your initiative and get on with whatever needs doing. I imagine after a while it's pretty instinctive. So you think you have initiative, Angelica? Oh, I definitely do, said Angelica. I rarely do. I can't claim to have the kind of dynamic credentials that many of the people out there may have, with their fancy curriculum vitas, but I've worked as a waitress for over 2 years. I'm efficient, honest, reliable, and hard-working. Well, Angelica, thank you for coming. You may see yourself out. We've got your details. We'll be in touch shortly. And don't forget what I said. Please don't sell yourself short. As Angelica left the hunting lodge, she walked past the long line of nervous young women waiting to be interviewed. She knew in her gut that she was already defeated. How could she ever hope to acquire such a prestigious position, with so much seriously threatening competition, all for the same job? While the interviewer had been terribly nice and offered her some encouraging words of wisdom, Angelica knew there were young women here applying for the position with years of experience behind them, working at top venues, experience that she clearly lacked. Angelica knew what competition was like. She'd grown up with 8 brothers and sisters as a young girl. It had been a struggle to get her mother's undivided, circumspect attention, as her mother was constantly having to appease all her children all the time, in her all-consuming job as a mother. It was natural for her siblings to compete for their parents' love, validation, and approval. Growing up with stiff competition between her siblings, it had felt like a losing battle, for it seemed that her mother always gravitated towards 2 children who seamlessly managed to gain her favour. For Angelica, it was not a tightrope that she was willing to walk, as you could so easily slip and fall, and next week another sibling might be her mother's flavour of the week. Growing up, she had learnt that there was always someone prettier, brighter, cleverer, richer, faster than she was, so she decided all you could ever do in life was try your very best. Well, I did all I could do, Angelica told herself, climbing into her battered car and driving away. But if she didn't get this job, it would mean returning to her overcrowded home. She longed for space, freedom, solace, and a measure of independence. To live away from her family home was her greatest desire. She knew the chances of acquiring the job were remote. So imagine how astounded she was to discover that out of that sea of impressive applicants, she was the one that had received the job. She could hardly believe it. Angelica had blended into life at the hunting lodge with an unflawed excellent ease. She was thoroughly enjoying the experience. The lodge was magnificent. The staff quarters in the left wing of the house were utterly luxurious. The woman, Mrs. Nora Madam, who had interviewed her, was the manager in charge of overseeing and controlling all the operations at the hunting lodge. She ran the place with the efficiency, proficiency and efficaciousness, along with the steely grit of a captain of a large ship, with a potent skillfulness that meant she made things look terribly easy, when in fact they were definitely not. Although she was a tough woman, she possessed a rather endearing, benevolent, congenial warmth to her character that Angelica was pleasantly surprised to discover. She had a sharp wit and could be utterly charming, and was quick to become like a matriarch figure in Angelica's life. One day Mrs. Madam would become to Angelica the mother she never had. Angelica's account in her own words. As Mrs. Madam had warned me, I was to find my job as vacillating, variable and fluctuating as the weather, so in truth I never ever got bored. But some of the demands of the rich and famous could be extreme and over the top, for they would request anything that tickled their fancy, and they weren't afraid to ask for it either, regardless of how over the top it might sound or appear. On one occasion I had to hire a painter to paint the esteemed guest's bedroom lilac. She couldn't abide sleeping anywhere that wasn't adorned in her favourite colour, and in fact she refused to sleep anywhere that wasn't lilac. I had to organise comforters, curtains and accessories for her bedroom to be done in lilac, as well as complementary shades. Luckily I was quite good at interior design, so I managed to transform her room into a stunning suite that was fabulous. We decided to keep it like that for our future guests. I had one elderly female guest called Irma Huxley, who needed her dog to be served fillet steak, poached salmon, chicken or turkey twice a day, with braised vegetables and mashed potato. She was very particular about her dog, a male schnauzer called Mr. Huxley. She told me that after her husband had died, her dog became the new man of the house, and hence his name was Mr. Huxley. I will say this, Mr. Huxley had one of the shiniest, healthiest coats I've ever seen in a dog, and he'd never eaten a drop of kibble a day in his life. In fact, I doubt he even knew what kibble was. Mrs. Huxley boasted to me tirelessly that her vet claimed he was the most salubrious dog he'd ever seen. "I don't understand all these scientific diets, dear," she would exclaim to me, "that insist you give your dogs and cats kibble. Do you know how bad those dry diets are for the kidneys and liver? Too dreadful for words," she tutted. "But these days people will do almost anything to get rich quick, especially those dried food manufacturers, even at the expense of our animals' health. I'll tell you something about this world of ours, dear. Everything is agenda-driven, from the pharmaceutical industry to the food industry. We are fed a bunch of lies in order to be swathed and manipulated to believe what they want us to believe. Never mind the truth. That's irrelevant, dear. All that matters is to make those fat boys in power get even richer and even fatter." Mrs. Huxley wanted me to take her dog for a walk twice a day. She had come to the hunting lodge not to hunt or fish, but just to relax, receive a little pampering from the in-house beauty salon, where she indulged in a plethora of beauty treatments, from massages to exfoliation treatments, wraps, essential oil infusions, and anti-aging procedures. She also read books and went for casual country strolls. She called upon my services regularly when her eyes grew tired, and she wanted someone to read her book for her, and so I did just that. I was beginning to realise that there were no boundaries or limitations in the world of the entitled and the fabulously wealthy, who believed they could pretty much buy anything they wanted for themselves, anything that their hearts desired. I had one woman who literally wanted me to dress her from naked and brush her hair like the lady's maid on Downton Abbey, attending to the likes of Lady Mary. In truth, I didn't mind dressing the poor old woman, but I did ponder on what it was like to be so lazy that you wouldn't even want to pull up your own knickers. If someone were to do such an intimate procedure on me, let's just say I would be more than a little self-conscious, but some people have absolutely no shame. On one occasion I'd gone fishing with an old lady who wanted some company. I'd eaten all my meals with her and been privy to drinking the most expensive French champagne. So my job was exceedingly interesting, and there was never a dull moment. There were, of course, times I was asked to help in reception or clean up someone's bedroom, which was less exciting, of course. One of the most horrifying things that ever happened at the hunting lodge took me a long time to come to terms with. In truth, I'll never forget that day as long as I live. It is indelibly entrenched in my mind and can never be erased. We had an elderly man called Mr. Beard staying at the lodge, in a grand suite with us, who looked much like his name suggests, for he had a rather magnificent Gandalf-like black beard, the kind of beard you can win awards for, I'm told. He also had brown hooded eyes, a very big prominent eagle-like hooked nose, a bald head which he covered with a black bandana all the time. He was visiting the lodge to sharpen his hunting skills and techniques, under the instruction and guidance of one of our consummate teachers. He was here to enjoy hearty, delicious, high-quality food, gastronomic masterpieces created by our illustrious chefs, and casual country strolls in the fabulously beautiful countryside. It was at luncheon the very next day that he was handed the telephone from the waiter. When Frederick the waiter saw the man's brown eyes become watery and his face pale significantly, he knew instinctively that the poor man had had a terrible shock. He could tell when someone had received very bad news. Frederick asked him, "Sir, is everything all right? You look very pale." "No," barked Mr. Beard, "it most certainly is not all right. If you must know, my wife has just died. The nursing home phoned to tell me." The waiter said to him, "I'm very, very sorry, sir. My deepest condolences, sir, for your loss. Is there anything I can possibly do?" "Yes, there is. Send me a bottle of your finest, most expensive champagne, Frederick, and make it as quick as you possibly can. I wouldn't mind a few chocolate truffles as well while you're about it." "Yes, sir. Will that be all?" "That will be all," said Mr. Beard. "But as I said, make it quick. I need it now." "Yes, sir," said Frederick. The waiter sent up a bottle of his very best champagne, which seemed an odd thing to have to do after his wife had just died, which made the waiter wonder if he was celebrating the death of his wife by bursting open a bottle of effervescent bubbles. I mean, after all, did you not order the finest champagne for a celebration? Maybe his wife was a dragon, he thought, who had made his life a living hell. A short while later, a huge gunshot was heard going off in the house. It practically shook the mansion limb from limb, rocking the entire mansion as if the house itself was a huge ocean liner that had gone plunging into an iceberg, rather like the Titanic. It was impactful, that gunshot was. I assure you, everyone heard it. I was 2 doors away from the room when it happened, so I instinctively knocked on the door. "Mr. Beard! Mr. Beard! Are you all right, Mr. Beard?" I then pushed open the door, but there was no sign of Mr. Beard in the bedroom suite, although the television was on and blaring away loudly on the horse-riding channel. "Mr. Beard! Mr. Beard, are you in there?" There was no answer. I opened the bathroom door. It creaked open very slowly. The room was very steamy and hot. The mirror was covered in mist with the words "I'm sorry" written in the mist. The finished champagne was lying in a tall ice bucket standing right next to the bath. A glass champagne flute lay smashed into hundreds of thousands of pieces on the floor. A white towel had turned bright crimson. Mr. Beard was lying in a bright scarlet pool of his own blood, with the end of a rifle emerging through the water. He was completely naked, having shot himself in the head. There was blood everywhere, along with pieces of brain matter, skull with hair attached to it. It was the most horrific scene that I've ever seen in my life. I screamed and screamed at the top of my lungs in horror of what I was perceiving. It was such a gruesome, macabre, haunting scene from the most graphic nightmare. I remember being very annoyed by the sound of the scream, wondering to myself who the heck was making such a god-awful commotion, and why the hell wouldn't they just shut up, when Mrs. Madam was standing over me, slapping my face. Calm down, she told me. To my horror, I realised that the discomposing "I'm being murdered" kind of scream had come from me. I never knew my lungs were capable of such an atrocious, ear-splitting vocal assault. Suffice to say, I was to learn that the authorities found a note on his desk saying I can't live without my beloved. I'm sorry. Needless to say, Nora Madam was very displeased, irked and disgruntled. I'd go so far as to say she was angry with the bereaved Mr. Beard, feeling very little sympathy for his dreadful plight. She saw his actions as exceedingly selfish and self-centred. If he was going to do this, she said indignantly, why didn't he have the decency to go into the woods with his bottle of champagne and blow his head off in there? Now we have a crime scene in our hunting lodge, she tutted angrily, as Mrs. Madam was a very practical, hands-on woman. This bad publicity is all we need for our hunting lodge, she told me. Imagine if the word gets out about this suicide with Mr. Beard. It could be terribly bad from a business perspective. It could really affect how well we do here in the future. Indeed, the police were called, as was the coroner. The place was covered with crime scene tape. You'd think it would have put all our guests off, staying in a large mansion where a man had taken his own life. But on the contrary, the people were stirred up with a macabre kind of excitement and curiosity as they watched the scene unfold. It rather reminded me of a horrific accident you see on the highway, where all the cars suddenly begin to slow down so that they can have a quick glimpse of what is going on, as the drivers are gripped by intrigue and curiosity. It was almost certainly like that in our mansion, as the various visitors, from the police inspectors to the coroner and the crime scene cleaners, came and went. It was like a movie scene being reenacted into real life. Our guests just loved it, especially when we were all being interviewed by the police. It was like that fabulously beguiling scene on Murder on the Orient Express, where all the affluent guests are interviewed and examined by the famous esteemed Belgian detective Hercule Poirot about where they were at the time of the murder. I think it made our guests feel very involved, as if they were whisked up in a real-life enthralling murder mystery, only this was a straightforward suicide. I was personally asked by the police inspector what kind of interaction I'd had with Mr. Beard. Did I get the impression he was depressed? Did he ever speak about his sickly wife to me, who had been dying of cancer at the nursing home? Regretfully, I had to say no to all those questions. It appeared that another guest, a man called Mr. Finnegan, who was staying with us, knew more about Mr. Beard than anybody else did. He told the police that his wife was the love of his life, but bone cancer had ravaged her body so badly that he'd come to the hunting retreat for a brief escapism from her, as being around her 24/7, watching her deteriorate and wither away, had been all too much for him. I was the one to ask help redesign the whole suite after Mr. Beard's tragic demise. The whole bathroom had to be gutted, with all its fixtures and fittings discarded. Some of Mr. Beard's blood had seeped beneath the marble tiles of the bathroom floor. Quite literally, the whole room had to be torn apart limb from limb. Mrs. Madam was very disquieted and plagued by the deep concern that anyone hearing about the suicide of Mr. Beard would be put off staying at the lodge. But it would seem no publicity is bad publicity at all. She was even more fretful that no one would want to stay in the suite where Mr. Beard had taken his own life, but she couldn't have been more wrong about that either. On the contrary, business at the hunting lodge boomed like never before. Ironically, the prestigious, extravagant, ornate suite that had been recently refurbished and redecorated, where Mr. Beard had taken his own life, was highly sought after by many of our stinking rich, most plutocratic guests, who pacifically booked the room where the suicide had occurred, confessing that they hoped to see Mr. Beard's ghost, for it would seem it was as close as their moneyed pockets would buy them a night in a luxurious haunted mansion, so to speak, so the excitement of this possibility became electric for them. It was all really rather bizarre. We did have one guest who claimed that the ghost of Mr. Beard had been standing over her bed. I'd never seen anyone so excited, riveted or animated as she was when telling everybody her astounding account, right down to all the cleaning staff. She was determined that everybody was going to hear what she had to say. I was naturally cynical about the woman's dubious story. She delighted in telling me the grisly details. Many of our guests actually offered her good money for a night to stay in her room to see if they too could have an encounter with Mr. Beard. But she had refused point blank. "I've paid good money to be in the haunted room," she told everyone. "I'm not about to go about handing over my privileges to all and sundry." The woman was in her late 60s with a full head of grey hair, which she scraped away from her face into a ponytail. "Of course," she told me, "I did book the room because I was hoping to see Mr. Beard's ghost. But I was highly cynical that it would actually happen. But I was hopeful, and it seems my expectancy was rewarded with results, so I'm most pleased to have had this encounter. I can now tick it off my wish list. So you weren't scared about the possibility of seeing a ghost? I'd asked her. Oh, absolutely not, she told me. Anyway, I did hear this noise, she told me, a shuffling noise. I saw this man with a limp on his right leg, staggering forward with his walking stick. He was wearing a black bandana on his head, a scarlet dressing gown around his body, walking across the floor to the bathroom. The figure was so real I actually thought someone had accidentally turned in for the night into the wrong bedroom suite. It didn't occur to me that this was a ghost. I was under the impression ghosts are translucent, whereas this man looked solid, just like you or me. I said, "Excuse me, sir." He turned around to look at me, but his sockets were empty. His face had a very long, straggly black beard. Then he just disappeared before my eyes, as if I'd just switched off a light. I didn't know what to make of the woman's story, but I did know that Mr. Beard had a scarlet dressing gown and wore a black bandana. He also had a limp to his right leg, caused by an accident when riding his Harley-Davidson. How could she have known all this? Needless to say, she never saw him again after that. But after her encounter, word got around like wildfire. People called us to book the haunted room number 105. A room which many have claimed to feel as if they're being watched, have felt cold spots, heard movement, seen light orbs and heard a gunshot going off. So contrary to Mr. Beard's suicide being bad for business, the reverse was almost certainly true. This was a haunted room for the rich and famous. The next bizarre thing that happened in the lodge was that Mrs. Madam told me that 2 men were shooting in the woods, and at 12 o'clock midday they would agree to stop shooting so that I could deliver them sandwiches and cold drinks, but I was asked to wear a bright orange vest over my jeans and sweatshirt. I went to the kitchen to gather the picnic basket. As I made my approach to the woodgrove, it suddenly occurred to me that I hadn't been told where the men were hunting. They had scouted the woodgrove the previous day, where the vast grove sprawled out for many miles all over the property, so in effect they could pretty much be anywhere. I seem to recall that many of the hunters chose to hunt on the right-hand side of the woodgrove, opposite the large meadows where the horses grazed. In truth, I was being lazy, thinking it was too much trouble to go back and get the men's coordinates, which was what I should have really done. I mean, what was I thinking? Because in truth, the men could literally be hunting anywhere on the property, but I was sure I could easily locate them. I mean, how naive was I? As I ambled past the horse meadow, I stopped to caress a couple of black and bay horses, whom adored being fussed over. I made my way to the right-hand side of the woodgrove. The one thing about staying in this part of the world was that I couldn't fail to notice how magnificent everything was. Indeed, this was true, as from the moment I woke up in the mornings and pulled back the curtains to admire the countryside, I would be in awe of the viridescent green of the vegetation, the fields of sagebrush, the prickly pears, the wheatgrass, the blue gamma, and the cobalt blue colour of the sky. The countryside in this part of Colorado blows your mind. It's idyllic and mesmerisingly beautiful. The woodgroves of the lodge consist of a plethora of different tree species, from bristlecone pines, blue spruces, Douglas firs, logpole pines, quaking aspens, cottonwoods, mountain junipers, and white firs. My all-time favourite are the quaking aspen trees. I adore the way the trees quake. I also love the mountain juniper, as these trees are considered to be sacred by the indigenous people. I walked through the shaded expanse, carrying a picnic basket in my hands, prepared by the chef, into the woodgrove where there were hiking trails, occasional open clearings and rocky outcrops. The woodgrove itself was superbly shaded. The tall trees gathered together in congenial clusters, penciling up into the skies like tall, vertical, slender giants. I walked down the paths, delighting in the bird song that was very pronounced, but I never detected any of the birds, as they were possibly nesting in the highest branches of the trees. As I walked into the woodgrove, I saw pink ribbons attached to some trees. They looked brand new, so I followed them, assuming that they would lead me to the 2 hunters. All of a sudden it was as if the bird song had just dissipated. Everything became very quiet. It was an airy, creepy feeling that did leave me feeling ever so slightly discomposed and uneasy. But I told myself that the reason it was so quiet was because the 2 hunters were hiding in the shadows. The animals they were stealthily stalking had figured it out, discerning their presence, for the indigenous wildlife are exceedingly astute. They can pick up human odour, noises or even movements very fast. If they know you're around, let's just say they will abandon the location where you have procured your hunting stand. Invariably you will walk away disappointed, thinking that no deer came your way, but that was possibly because they picked up your presence a long time ago. I had heard the 2 hunters today were not that experienced, so in my humble opinion it was rather likely that they had scared everything off unwittingly. I was walking when I suddenly became uneasy, as I thought that something was staring at me. You know when someone is looking at you, it's a feeling you can't dismiss. You know you're not imagining it. But as I glanced around the woodgrove, I could see nothing there. But why was I so certain that something was scrutinizing me? Then I saw a shadowy movement and a human-like silhouette skulking through the trees. I thought it must be one of the hunters, so I confidently dashed through the trees. "Excuse me, sir," I was saying. "I've got your picnic lunch you ordered." I was lifting up my basket towards the figure, and as my eyes adjusted to the light, I realized standing only yards away from me was not a man, but a Bigfoot. For a moment I was so stunned I just froze on the spot. You would think I would have dropped my basket and run for the hills, screaming at the top of my lungs, but this is not what happened to me. I was to learn that it takes the human body time to adjust to shock. It's like for a moment you're jolted out of your reality to face a scene before your eyes that does not align with what you consider real. Much like hypothetically if you were going out into your backyard and you saw a spaceship standing there and green men entering the strange craft. The first thing that happens to you is you doubt what you're seeing. This can't be real, you say to yourself. It takes you a long while to accept that it actually is real. That's what happened to me. The next thing that happens is you are so intrigued by what you're perceiving that an inquisitive curiosity overrides your fear. I mean, in truth, this creature was the most intimidating, awesome specimen I've ever seen. But I was not filled with fear at that very moment, but complete astonishment that a creature like this could actually exist in North America. I think my eyes were round, my mouth wide with astonishment, as I surveyed this extraordinary creature. I would say he was about 8 foot tall, between 600 to 700 pounds, and over 3 foot wide across the shoulder area. He was covered with a reddish-brown hair, the colour of orangutan. It was long and flowing. The creature was studying me through his deep-set dark brown eyes. I realised I was still holding the picnic basket up towards him as if I was giving it to him. He thought I was, because he reached out to take it from me with a curious bemused expression on his face, but he did look pleased. I knew that the basket contained cold lobster salad, stuffed avocados filled with prawns and caviar, cashew and lentil burgers, Mediterranean rice salad, chocolate brownies, apple juice and cold beers. The creature took the basket from me. He grunted approvingly, nodding his head up and down in a gesture of thanks. And then I watched him gliding away. He disappeared quickly into the undergrowth and was gone. I gasped. I stood there for a while, hardly able to believe what I was seeing. I turned around and walked away, minus my picnic basket, knowing I was going to have to tell the chef to make another basket. The next thing I knew was that the creature ran back to me, tapping me on my back. I turned around, bewildered to see the creature again. He placed a river stone in my hands, nodded again, and glided away. I guess he must have been very pleased with the picnic basket. I studied the river stone curiously. It was warm to the touch, having been held in the creature's hand. It was also quite pretty. I asked the chef to make up another picnic basket. He seemed perturbed, but he did so anyway, without asking me any awkward questions. He was used to the strange requests and demands from our guests. I found the coordinates for the hunters and was able to bring them their delayed lunch. Let's just say they weren't too enamoured by the delay. I confided in Mrs. Madam that I had encountered a Bigfoot. "You encountered a Bigfoot in the woods?" she asked me. "Yes, I did," I told her. Mrs. Madam tried to digest this astounding revelation, but I knew she believed me. "Don't breathe a word about this to anyone." I never did, although I will tell you, the picnic basket was indeed delivered to our front door, containing a few more river stones, so I guess the creature thought the picnic was exceptionally good. He wasn't wrong about that. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.